Our next speaker is a contributing editor to the Review of the News. He spent 2 years within the youth apparatus of the Communist Party as an undercover operative for Chicago Police Intelligence. In December of 1967, he accepted the invitation of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee to testify in executive session regarding his knowledge of the activities and personnel of the communist W.E.B. Du Bois clubs and the Students for a Democratic Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David E. Gumaer.
Thank you, Scott. Members of the panel, and ladies and gentlemen. Scott has asked that I give you a few examples of some of my more interesting experiences as a reporter for American Opinion, Review of the News, and actually take a seminar just to cover some of the more exciting encounters. But the one thing that I remember the most is the time that I was asked to go to Montreal, Canada to cover the Hemispheric Conference in the war in Vietnam. Of course, I didn't realize what I was getting into. I would much rather have sat home eating turkey dinner with Scott and his family and others of my friends. But as Gary has already outlined for us, you know how Scott is about those things. So he decided on Thanksgiving morning to send me up to Montreal. At first I was supposed to have met with a group of communists in Harvard Square. That's, of course, where they all gathered. We all know that, Red Square. But they didn't wait for me. They had left on the bus, and in the auto caravans they'd already gone early, so I missed the crowd that I'd made contact with some weeks earlier, and they thought I was one of the comrades. So I caught a plane for Montreal. It was raining. It was early Thursday morning, Thanksgiving. It was raining quite heavily when I got into Montreal, and made my way to the church, as it was where the gathering was being held. There were some 2,000 communists and fellow travelers who'd flown in from all over the world to participate in an affair that was, in fact, they were there to plan the final phases of the overthrow of the United States of America. Some years earlier, these very communists had met in Havana, Cuba, to plan the spontaneous riots which were to break out in the streets of our country in the so-called ghetto areas, and they did break out right on cue in Harlem and Watts and other areas, Detroit, Cleveland. They broke out right on cue. It was planned in Havana, Cuba. Well, here they were in Montreal, 2,000 strong from all over the world. Large contingent came in from South America, groups of labor union leaders, young revolutionaries from various countries in South America, members of the Tupamaros and other communist action groups there. Quite a few of these individuals were there to plan the encircling program of the communist apparatus. I got into a conversation with the son of Chadijigan, a young communist who was there bragging about what he was doing in that part of the world. I spoke with Enrique Arias, the communist leader of the University of Mexico, who was bragging to us there how they were using the strategy of confrontation, how they were using guerrilla warfare tactics to take that university and other universities in South America. I spoke with Salvador Allende, the communist leader of Chile, the man who now has a dictatorship in that part of the world. They were there bragging to us how they were moving themselves into positions of power, infiltration, permeation techniques, how they were taking over one country after another to encircle the United States. There was also, of course, a number of Americans there. They showed up from the Black Panther Party, from the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs, the youth arm of the party, from the SDS, the Progressive Labor Party, American Friends Service Committee, Fellowship of Reconciliation, American Civil Liberties Union, National Lawyers Guild. They were there in force from this country. And since this was held in Canada, the host country, there were a number of Canadian people there, Canadian media from the television and radio, from the movies, entertainment field. They were there well represented. In fact, I spoke with Raymond Boyer, a fellow I later discovered was identified some years earlier, had been identified in Ottawa as a Soviet espionage agent. But of course, the man who was highly regarded by all these Canadians who were there at this conference, the man who was highly regarded by all of these individuals who were there to work for the communists, was of course Premier Elliott Trudeau of Canada. Now, he didn't show up for the conference, but nevertheless he allowed the conference to go on there in Montreal because, you see, Trudeau, for the past 20 years, according to intelligence officials, according to well-documented material which I've seen and which Alan Stang has found out himself when he went to Canada, Trudeau for the past 20 years has been a member of the Communist Party of Canada. He was trained in Moscow, he was trained in Peking, a personal friend of Mao Zedong, a friend of Fidel Castro. He was in Cuba, in Havana, the very day Castro moved in and took control of that country. So, of course, Trudeau was there, highly regarded by the communists who were holding this top-secret gathering in Montreal. We all know that Trudeau is named the head of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a communist. that he himself, as a member of the Communist Party, now controls Canada to a large degree. We know that today, Canada is in exactly the same position that Cuba was in 1958. Only the people there are simply not aware of that fact as yet, but they will be. Well, as I say, at this conference there were many, many thousands of not only revolutionaries but also hangers-on, members of the Trotskyite factions of the Progressive Labor Party, the Maoist faction, and of the Straight Line Communist Party from the Soviet Union faction. They were there in force. And in much the same way that we have our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines as part of our attack and defensive force, the communists at that lower echelon have their own organizations to carry out the revolution in the streets. They have those who do follow the teachings of Leon Trotsky. Those are the Progressive Labor Party, those are the Socialist Workers' Party and their youth arm, the Young Socialist Alliance, and they have their affiliates in Canada and various parts of the world. There are other groups like the Progressive Labor Party who for years have followed Mao Zedong, and of course there's the Straight Line CPUSA, Communist Party, and their youth arm, which is now called the Young Workers' Liberation League, formerly called the W.E.B. Du Bois Clubs of America, the SDS, the National Student Association, all these groups that were represented there in Montreal. There's also a group of Europeans who'd come in from Western Europe to observe this conference. Many reporters from some of the major magazines and newspapers in Europe were there. There was even, we were momentarily expecting a group of Soviets to come in as observers. They didn't quite make it. They got lost somewhere along the line. They didn't quite show up. But the guest of honor at that conference there in Montreal, and for 4 days in late November 1968, over the Thanksgiving weekend, was a group of Viet Cong agents who'd come in from Hanoi, sent there by Ho Chi Minh. They'd come in via the Paris peace talks. They'd stopped momentarily in Havana, Cuba to meet with Fidel Castro. These were the guests of honor, a group of Viet Cong agents. And as they entered the main hall, everyone stood at attention to wave their red flags and the Viet Cong banners to cheer these people on because they were the guests of honor. This group of communists were there to tell us how they were winning the war against what they call imperialist aggression in Southeast Asia, how they were winning the war against our forces in that part of the world. And for 4 days, I sat through conferences with these individuals, met many leaders of the Communist Party from all over the world, people like Wilfred Burchett, an Australian communist, a writer for The Guardian, a man who had worked during the Korean War with the Red Chinese to help brainwash our prisoners. And of course, the Red Chinese now have some 700 American prisoners of war rotting in concentration camps in Southeast Asia. And yet our president wants to build bridges to the benevolent Red Chinese, to send them $800 million in jet aircraft to make sure, to let them know that we're still their friends. Even though there are 700 Americans rotting in concentration camps in China, our president continues to want to aid and trade the very enemy that's killing our soldiers in Vietnam. For 4 days, I listened to all the communist rhetoric, the Marxist jargon, sat in on their workshops, their training sessions, met many old comrades that I'd known earlier in the movement, like Bettina Aptheker, the daughter of the chief theoretician for the Communist Party USA, Herbert Aptheker, a man who was a professor of black studies at Bryn Mawr University. Many individuals like this were there, well-known celebrities in the communist world in their own underground apparatus. They were there in force. Many top leaders of the party. There were also many letters of condolence and telegrams sent by some of our top senators like Javits and Gröning. Even Mrs. Martin Luther King and others sent letters to the Viet Cong telling them how they felt about their activities and the conflict in Vietnam. I later got into a conversation with Hoang Bit Son, the Minister of Culture of North Vietnam, and he was speaking to us there in broken French. And he was bragging to us. He was telling us how they were winning the war against imperialist aggression in Southeast Asia. Because you know the communists in that conflict know full well that our soldiers are sent into that battle to fight an enemy, a vicious enemy, and invariably those troops are not even allowed to carry loaded rifles. They're not allowed to fire on the enemy till they themselves are fired upon. And then, of course, it's too late. Our soldiers are not allowed to take any strategic ground in South Vietnam or North Vietnam. They're not allowed to take any area, hold it for any length of time. They're not really even allowed to bomb the surface-to-air missile sites along the coast, the SAM sites, shooting our planes and helicopters down by the thousands. They're off limits. And those SAM sites were invariably built by the Soviets. We're not really allowed to bomb the port of Haiphong in North Vietnam, the main port of entry for the communist ships coming in there to supply the enemy with the sinews of war to kill our soldiers. These are off limits. We cannot bomb or strafe into the Soviet ships in Haiphong Harbor, even though those ships supply up to 85% of the sinews of war to the Viet Cong. And those Russian ships are American-built Lend-Lease ships, which we loaned them during World War II. Fully one-third of the ships coming into Haiphong Harbor fly the flags and banners of England and France and Germany, our supposed allies. And they're off limits. We can't bother them. And every so often an American pilot gets carried away, goes into that fray and strafes a Soviet ship, and what happens? He gets court-martialed for his problems. Court-martialed for his troubles. We're not really even allowed to bomb any strategic target above the DMZ, especially around Hanoi. These are also off limits. We can bomb all the footbridges and the rice paddies and the huts and things of that type, but no strategic target, especially around Hanoi. We cannot bomb any of the missile sites, the marshalling arms. We cannot bomb any of the troop centers, the oil refinery, any of that activity there in North Vietnam. The strategic targets are off limits thanks to President Johnson, who issued his special order some years ago. We cannot really pursue the enemy to their privileged sanctuaries into Cambodia and Laos to stop them once and for all. We can't even cut the enemy supply line, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're not allowed to win that war. It's a no-win war. A war of accommodation, a war of a coalition government. They're pushing this now. It's a war in which our soldiers are being forced to fight and die with one arm tied behind their backs, while the enemy are being supplied by our own government. The enemy is being supplied by the U.S. government. And even though we are fighting Red Chinese on the line there, and even though many of the technicians in North Vietnam are Russians, our president continues to promote aid and trade with these very communist forces. It's a no-win war, a war of accommodation that's never even been declared a war. Our soldiers are being forced to fight and die in the most brutal, vicious battle we've ever had to encounter anywhere in the world. And never once has our president called for the word victory. Never once has he mentioned victory. Never once. Of course, the communist forces know all about that. They know that our soldiers are not being allowed to win. The communists know this full well in Vietnam. Our soldiers know it also. Those 300,000 who've been maimed in battle, who've lost their legs and their arms and their sight, they know it. And the American press knows it. But the American press is lying to the American people about what's happening. And our own government is lying to us. And the communists in Montreal, they knew what was going on in Vietnam. They knew full well. And they're very proud of that fact. In fact, when it was announced there that President Johnson had just called for another bombing halt, a huge cheer went up among all those communists because they realized full well that every time our side calls for another bombing halt, for whatever reason, we have all of our weapons taken away and locked up so that we won't create an international incident. Whereas the Viet Cong forces continue to mortar our positions, to murder our soldiers, to indiscriminately butcher the unarmed civilians in South Vietnam, to disembowel the women and cut the hands and legs off the small children and behead the village chieftains. Because the communist forces in that part of the world have never once and never will honor any kind of a treaty with us. Our government knows this, but they continue to push the hand of accommodation or of peace or whatever for the most brutal, vicious enemy we've ever faced anywhere at any time in the entire world. And those 50,000 young American soldiers who've died in battle, they know what's going on as well. As I say, for 4 days I sat in this kind of a conference there and talked with these people and sat rubbing shoulder to shoulder with the hardcore communists from all over the world, listening to all their plans as they were planning on destroying this nation, moving in for the kill. And finally, after all this period of time, we stood in the main hall there. I remember the communists, remember this very vividly. They stood there with their arms raised and the clenched fist salute, singing the Soviet Internationale, standing there before red flags and Viet Cong banners and UN flags and Russian banners, singing the Soviet Internationale, pledging their support for a communist enemy which has now butchered 50,000 of our soldiers in that no-win war, a war which we are not allowed to win. And do you know who the young sponsor and coordinator of that entire communist affair was in Montreal? Do you have any idea who the organizer of the Montreal conference was? Abby Rockefeller, the daughter of David Rockefeller, the president of the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. And where does David Rockefeller, a top member of the Council on Foreign Relations, where does this man, the top capitalist, take his vacations every year? Where does he go to relax from world tension? Why, to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, to the Kremlin, as a guest of the communist government there. That's something to think about, isn't it? Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the final phases of the world revolution, and we're rapidly losing that war through apathy and attrition. How many of you here tonight are aware of the fact that when the Communist Party USA was organized back in 1919, there were 40,000 members, organized out of the left wing of the Socialist Party. 10 years ago, Benjamin Gittler, one of the founders of the Communist Party, a man who held practically every key position in the Communist Party since its inception, a man who'd met with Joe Stalin in Moscow and later broke with the party and became a Christian and tried to expose the conspiracy by writing The Whole of Their Lives. He estimated 10 years ago that there were some 1 million communists and fellow travelers in the United States working for the overthrow of our system. And believe me, in addition to that, in the more recent years, there have been some 3 million alien communists come into this country through the immigration barriers which have been lowered by the Supreme Court decisions. They're coming in now from Red China by the thousands, 20,000 a year, I believe, is the quota, coming in from Hong Kong, settling on the West Coast. They're coming in, traveling on false visas and passports, taking off the dead bodies of others that they have eliminated to get those passports, coming to this country, very quietly melt into the background, get regular jobs, awaiting the word to begin the final push, the final phase of the world revolution. Now, these communists, as powerful as they are, and as deeply entrenched as they are in our system, especially in Washington and New York City and in the key areas of our country, as deeply entrenched as they are still in the minority. And the only thing they fear above all else, the only thing they fear at this stage of the revolution is exposure. Therefore, a most important weapon is truth, the truth in time. If you care for the future of your nation, if you care for your own children, if you care for their well-being, if you have the courage, join us and become a real nonconformist and stand up for America. Because, you know, my friends, in this war in which the communists have initiated against us, in this war in which they're destroying the minds of our youth through narcotics, through revolutionary propaganda, and on the battlefield in Vietnam and elsewhere around the world, in this war with the communists, there is simply no substitute for victory. Thank you.